All right. Hello, everybody. My name is David Boyles. I'm the research director from White Hat Research and Policy Group, and welcome to the first episode of our Democracy 101 video series. Excuse me. This is a series we're going to be doing on a pretty regular basis going forward. And so I'll just tell you a little about what we're doing here. So this is a series we came up with a couple months ago. Because of all of the attacks that have been happening on democracy and voting and the right to vote that have been happening across the country. And this is an issue that I have cared about a lot for a long time. I think it's super important, and we are now everyone is starting to realize how important it is. And so here at White Hat Research and Policy Group, our job is to try to inform the conversation here in Arizona around issues that matter to us in the state, to be the progressive voice for these issues here in the state. And so we thought talking about this stuff, bringing it to an audience is one of the most important things we can do right now. And one of the big focuses of this series is going to be how these attacks on democracy, attacks on voting, did not start with Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani spreading lies about stolen elections, did not start with the white supremacist mob attacking the Capitol to prevent Joe Biden from becoming president. This has been a part of American history going back to the very beginning of the country. And we are a country that was not a true, fully representative, multiracial democracy, some would argue ever, but was not even close to that up until the 1960s and the civil rights victories of the 1960s. But then even then, starting in the 1970s, there was this very well-funded, very well-organized conservative backlash to all of the progress that was made in the 1960s, including the progress around voting rights. And we are seeing the fruition a lot of that happening in the stuff we're seeing right now. And I want to talk about this in particular because throughout this history, our state, Arizona, has played a very important role and continues to play a very important role up to this day. We have right now in our state legislature several really draconian, really horrible bills being proposed to try to restrict the right to vote as a response to the fact that Republicans are now losing elections, the fact that Donald Trump did not win, that we have 2 Democratic senators now. And so we want to examine the history, kind of look at the big context that all of this stuff is happening in. And so this series, we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. I have a bunch of topics we're going to get into. But I wanted to start with one of the central topics in this conversation, which is the Voting Rights Act. And we're actually going to do kind of a 3-part mini-series on the Voting Rights Act, starting today and then the next 2 Thursday nights after this. We're going to do parts 2 and part 3 of that series. So tonight, we're just going to talk about what the Voting Rights Act is, where it came from, why it was needed, what it actually did. And then next week, we are going to get into how the Voting Rights Act impacted Arizona specifically, because Arizona has had a very important role in the history of this bill, going back to the creation of the bill in the 1960s, all the way up to today. And then that will take us into our 3rd episode 2 weeks from tonight, where we will look at the current attacks happening on the Voting Rights Act, particularly from the Supreme Court. We will talk about the Shelby County decision, which greatly weakened the Voting Rights Act. And then we're going to talk a lot about another case involving Arizona, Brnovich versus the DNC, which was the oral arguments were just held a couple weeks ago. This is the case involving a law here in Arizona. Our Attorney General, Mark Brnovich, is the named person in the suit. And it is looking like another opportunity for the conservatives on the Supreme Court to further gut the Voting Rights Act and prevent its effectiveness. So we'll be talking about all that. But like I said, tonight we're going to get into the Voting Rights Act itself, what it is, where it came from, all that kind of stuff. And we're going to have a lot of great guests over the coming weeks discussing this. For tonight, the guest that I wanted to bring on someone who is used to hearing me rant about weird things like the Compromise of 1877 and other things like that. So I have a great dear friend of mine and colleague, Dr. Tiffany Wilgar from Fairfield University in Connecticut. is coming in tonight to talk about this stuff with us. So I'm going to bring her in. Hey, Tiffany, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you, David?
Doing great. There we go. Got your name on the screen.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, like I said, I want to bring you in tonight. Again, as someone I've talked about this stuff before, so you're used to hearing me rant about it. And like I said, we're kind of looking at the connections. We're looking through the lens of Arizona, but also looking to the connections nationally as well. So like having someone from outside of Arizona, from a very different state than Arizona. And so we'll definitely talk about that. And so let's just jump right into it here. And how I wanted to start here was I just wanted to ask you, what do you know about the Voting Rights Act?
Oh, that's a fun question. Okay, so just to be clear, this is not my area of expertise at all. I do rhetoric and composition studies and technical communication. So that's my area of expertise for work. So this is outside of that. But what I know about the Voting Rights Act, let's see. This is 1965. Yes. Great. Okay.
Good start.
Okay, good. And 1965, this is John Lewis, one of John Lewis's legacies. And the Voting Rights Act was about repairing Black Americans' ability to vote easily in local and federal elections. But I'm not really sure exactly what happened because Black Americans had the right to vote and then somehow it was taken from them over time. And the Voting Rights Act was meant to kind of undo that legacy. And I'm not entirely sure exactly how that happened, really, other than just, I suppose, a series of efforts to keep restricting voting rights for Black Americans so much so that it was basically impossible. Does that make sense?
That totally does. That's actually really good. Yeah, and that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. So I have this kind of divided into 3 sections tonight. And the first one is, why did we need the Voting Rights Act? So let's get into that. And like you said, you ask a lot of people about the Voting Rights Act. I think people know it was passed in 1965. It's one of the big civil rights bills, along with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that's associated with the civil rights movement. And it is particularly associated with Congressman John Lewis, who passed away last year. So let's talk about that. So some important context here. And there's a bunch of stuff in here that I want to do whole episodes on later. So I'm going to try very quickly to kind of, move us through this stuff. So let's go back to the Constitution itself. And so when the Constitution was drafted in the original version of 1789, it said very little about the right to vote. Basically didn't even say you had a right to vote. It just said that there are, need to be elections held, and that the states have the power to do those elections, has the power to determine, quote, the time, place, and manner of elections.
Right, I have a question. Could it be argued that it was strongly implied that citizens have the right to vote in a democracy, in a democratic republic? It's inherent to the type of government we have, right? That's why it's not stated explicitly, because it's strongly implied by the type of government we have. Or would you say I'm wrong on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Though I think the key part there is when you say it's strongly implied that we have the right to vote, who that we is.
Okay, all right, got you. Okay.
It was said that states should hold elections, which implies a democratic system. But who got to actually vote in those elections and how those elections were done were left up to the states. And it was, I think at the time especially, it was implied that who those people were was a very particular group, white, male, landowning, all of those things. So this is why, this goes back to why we have such a patchwork and complicated system of voting in the U.S., because states typically set their election laws. There's no real sort of federal mechanism. That's why we were just talking a little earlier. You were talking about early voting in Connecticut. And do you want to talk a little about that? I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, sure. I moved to Connecticut in 2018, but I'm a Southwest girl. I was born in Las Vegas, Nevada, so I haven't been up here for very long. And I was surprised when I moved up here that we only have election day to vote in Connecticut, which seems strange because, you know, Connecticut has this reputation for being very blue and very progressive. And it's got this kind of antiquated, you know, voting system where there's no early voting at all. And I found out that that restriction is written into Connecticut's state constitution. And so different activist groups and different lawmakers have been trying to undo that for years, but it takes it's a very laborious, you know, and time consumptive process to change a state constitution. And I thought that it was interesting that limitation was literally written into the Constitution, which, I mean, I'm sure you're going to get into this, which to me just seems like, you know, racism being written into the state constitution. That's what it reads like to me. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean,
you guys have early voting. You guys have a pretty progressive voting system in Arizona, yes?
Yeah, here in Arizona, we have, first of all, we have mail-in voting. And so if you sign up for, at least as it exists now, they're trying to change this right now. We'll get into that later. But as it exists right now, if you sign up for what we call the PEVL, the Permanent Early Voting List, you get your ballot mailed to you 27 days before the election. And it usually comes in a couple days after that. And then you have up until election day to turn that ballot back in by mailing it in or, you know, taking it to the polling place. And then we also do have early voting, early in-person voting that starts a few days after that. That goes up until the weekend before elections. So you know, basically the month before the election can vote either by mail or in person, you know, up until election day. And we have here in Arizona, I think it's, you know, close to 80% of people, you know, typically vote before election day now, you know, either through mail or in-person vote, in-person early voting. And yeah, so that's the thing. We have this very kind of patchwork, complex system because it was left to the states to figure this stuff out. And then we fast forward a little bit to the Civil War and to the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, which were adopted after the Civil War. 13th, of course, in slavery. The 14th creates the Equal Protection Clause so that everyone is protected under the law. And then the 15th Amendment says that, and I have my quote here in my notes, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." So this was a specific, you know, constitutional amendment saying, you know, you cannot restrict voting based on race and color, or it says previous condition of servitude, basically meaning the formerly enslaved people. And then, really importantly, the 15th Amendment also includes this other clause, which the 14th also does, which says that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So it actually empowers Congress to, you know, enforce this law and to basically interfere in the state's elections if they are not following these things, which is a big change. Before, it was completely hands-off. Congress had no role in the state's election systems. But this was basically saying, you know, after the Civil War, there were some states that maybe need to, you know, have a closer eye kept on them for, you know, some obvious reasons. You can kind of guess what those states were, you know, to make sure they did not, you know, abridge the right, you know, of people, of particularly, you know, Black, newly freed Americans to vote. And so that would seem to solve the problem, right? You know, like it says, you know, 1860.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. We're still talking about men, right? Like we're not even talking about women. Like they're not even in the dugout to be up to bat, right? Okay, just to clarify.
Yeah, there's a whole other story about that. Of there was a big split, in particular between Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony over this issue. Of you had at this time, there were a lot of the suffragists were also abolitionists, and the people like abolitionists like Frederick Douglass were also suffragists who were fighting for the right of women to vote. And basically there was a compromise, you know, including women was going to be a no-go in getting this approved. And so folks like Frederick Douglass and a lot of the other proponents of Black suffrage kind of left the women hanging out to dry on that. And, there was a version of the 15th Amendment that would have included women, but it got cut. And so women, and again, there are some states, by state law, states could allow women to vote. Arizona actually, when we became a state in 1912, allowed women to vote way, before the 19th Amendment gets passed. But yeah, at the federal level, at this point, women, are out of luck. And again, this was a big division between the movement. If you know of Susan B. Anthony's, unfortunate racist comments, a lot of those came directly out of this whole situation. She made some very unfortunate comments after this. So yeah, gender is not a part of it, but race is, and Congress can enforce it. The problem then, of course, becomes in 1877. This is the Compromise of 1877, which I want to do a whole episode on. It's this super obscure moment that I'm obsessed with, because this is the end of Reconstruction. This is when the federal government basically gives up on the South and pull the troops out. They end the Reconstruction project, and they essentially let all these former Confederate states fall back into the control of the people who just declared war on the government 15 years earlier. So that's the end of Reconstruction. It's the beginning of what we know as the Jim Crow era, when all of these states start passing all kinds of laws restricting African Americans in all kinds of ways. But this is where it gets really important. And it's something you mentioned earlier. So by the Constitution, the one thing these states could not do was say Black people cannot vote. They cannot pass a law that says that. So they just did everything else that they could to prevent Black people from voting. And a lot of these we are familiar with: poll taxes, literacy tests. They had while the general elections were not allowed to restrict on race, primary elections could be. So the Democratic primary, and the Democratic Party was the only party in the South at this point. They could restrict to only white people, and then cut out people out of the primary process.
Right. And is it true that the phrase "grandfathered in" is a racist, voting restriction tactic? Mm-hmm. Because if your grandfather could vote, then that means that you can vote without having to pay the poll tax or take the literacy test or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. So then again, it doesn't say if you're a Black American you can't vote, mm-hmm. right? But it's working around that.
Yeah. Right? No, exactly. Yeah, that was the thing. So they passed these poll taxes and these literacy tests, and they realized, oh, there's a bunch of white people who can't pay the poll taxes and can't read. A lot of right. Poor white people in the South
can't pass the literacy test. Yeah.
Yeah. And so some of the states passed these things saying, yeah, if your grandfather could vote, then you don't have to do these things, which is where grandfather clause comes from, grandfathered in. And yeah, of course, if you are a newly freed, African American, your grandfather was a slave, so they could not vote. And so, yeah, doing everything they could without saying the word, well, they probably wouldn't have used this word, but saying the word Black American, they probably would have used other words. But without saying Black people can't vote, they could do everything else. And now, of course, the thing about this is at any point, Congress and the Supreme Court could have stepped in this period and been like, no, that is obviously, intended to keep Black people from voting. So that is a no-go. But they didn't. Again, there was, basically an agreement, really, again, bartered at the end of a gun to prevent a rebellion in 1877 that said, we're not going to interfere in the South anymore. And so that's what happened. So this goes on. The other way, of course, that these restrictions on Black people voting were enforced was violence and intimidation. There were some places where if you registered to vote, your name and address got published in the newspaper. And then the KKK shows up, and so there were all these ways.
That's awful. That's horrible. Yeah. I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. Published in the newspaper. Yeah. So that means the publishers, government at the local, state, and federal level, mm-hmm. and everybody's complicit. Mm-hmm. This racism is just stacked.
Yeah. So racism all the way down. Yeah.
Yeah, it's racism all the way down.
Yeah. So that's the thing. And so that takes us into the 1960s. This is essentially from 1877 into the 1960s. This is the system that's in place. But again, there are all these restrictions, and in a lot of places in the South, there were some Black people who could register. They would allow at least a few people to do it, which again gives them this air of plausible deniability. If it comes up, they're like, no, they have the right to register. And look, there's these 3 people in the county. And often what you heard, which is now a lot what you hear in a lot of the legislation that's going on today, is like, these people just don't want to vote. They just don't want to do it. So it gives this level of plausible deniability, which becomes super important as we move along in the story here. So this takes us into the 1960s, and this gets us to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was the student arm of the Civil Rights Movement. This was the organization that John Lewis helped found and became the president of. And they very early on identified that voting rights, way before King and a lot of the other older leaders of the movement, they identified that voting was the key issue. It was the key to everything else, more than lunch counters, more than the segregated drinking fountains and things like that. They sent people into places like Selma, Alabama, Macomb, Mississippi, where these restrictions were most severe. And there were these people like Robert Moses, who I want to do a whole episode on in the future, who spent years just driving around these backcountry towns in Mississippi, trying to convince these Black farmers to register to vote. And often when people did, they did get killed. And then it takes us into the Freedom Summer in 1964, when these white civil rights workers from the North come down to help register to vote. This is the Mississippi burning incident, where Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney were out registering people to vote when they were murdered by, it's always reported as by the sheriff's department or the KKK, but that's kind of a potato thing because everybody in the sheriff's department was in the KKK. So,
right. And I mean, I've known a history of American lynchings in the South and in other places, but I guess I never really tied it so explicitly to voting rights. I mean, it makes sense now that I think about it, but I guess I just didn't really realize that they were so intertwined. And I don't know, that sucks. This is disheartening.
Yeah. Well, it's not going to get better. Sorry. Well, actually, it does get a little better, and then it gets worse again. Right. But yeah, so this is what takes us to the famous Selma campaign in 1965. This is when Dr. King, his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, gets involved. We have the famous marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which are all meant to put pressure on Lyndon Johnson to get a voting rights bill. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was really upset that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not include voting. And so we get this pressure and the bill gets passed, and we'll move along there. I'm, of course, already failing at my attempts to keep these brief. I'm already way over my time that I allotted, which I knew was going to happen. All right, so let's get us into what the Voting Rights Act actually did. So there's a lot of parts to it. There's 2 parts I want to talk about in particular. Section 2 and then sections 4 and 5. So section 2 is called the Prohibition of Practices to Deny the Right to Vote Based on Race. And so this is a general set of things that applies to all the states across the country that you cannot do because they are designed to discriminate, based on race and prevent, people from voting based on their race. And we're talking here, because we're in the South here, we're talking primarily about preventing Black people from voting. As we will get into next week with Arizona, a lot of these same practices in other states like Arizona were used to prevent Latino people from voting, Native Americans from voting, so these go kind of across the board. So these ban things like racial gerrymandering, where you deliberately, stack all of people of one race in one district to dilute the power of their vote. Things like the primary system, the closed primary system, voter registration procedures. So it outlaws these things, and it allows you as a citizen, if you believe a particular voting law or regulation in your state or in your county is discriminatory, you can bring a suit, in federal court and get that overturned. So that is the first part, and applies to all the states.
You know what? I feel like
Mhm.
I already know the ending of a novel, and now I'm curious about how we got from point A to point B. Because if the Voting Rights Act is it makes gerrymandering and all of this different stuff illegal, so why is North Carolina the way that it is? Like that's historical, that's current.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So now I'm curious. Now I'm invested. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah. The gerrymander thing, that's another episode. We will get into that later on down the road. But yeah, actually, North Carolina is a really interesting case in that they got in trouble for their gerrymander because they were too deliberately racist about it, basically. They did not do a good enough job hiding it. Because the one thing this doesn't do is outlaw partisan gerrymandering. So if you're like, oh no, we're not trying to keep, dilute the voting power of Black people, we're trying to dilute the voting power of Democrats, that's okay, which is a whole other conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that's the thing. And also the other issue with this, and the North Carolina one is a perfect example, this process takes years, so a state passes a law, you have to file a lawsuit. The North Carolina thing went on for almost a decade, back and forth in federal court, going to the Supreme Court, coming back to the federal court. And elections are going by, elections are happening. And, when you are denied your right to vote in an election, there is no remedy for that. You don't get that vote back. You can't go back and redo an election, which takes us to sections 4 and 5 and why these are super important. So section 4 created what was called the coverage formula, which basically created this formula for determining places that can have a history of racial discrimination in their voting practices. So it identifies, based on all these factors, hey, you are a state that needs kind of basically extra hand-holding on this stuff because of your history with racism. Again, if I asked you to guess what those states were, which ones do you think might have been covered under this?
Well, you know what? I've lived in the South, so there. But I've also lived in the Southwest and there. And then now I live in New England, and guess what? It's one of the most racist places I've ever lived. But New Englanders, like white New Englanders, are really unaware of that. It's and I'm just gonna say that everywhere is racist. So I don't know.
Yeah, that is true. But again, this is places that are specifically racist, and particularly when it comes to voting.
Yes.
And so, yeah, those are places like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana were covered under this. But also, there were counties in Hawaii that were originally covered in 1965 and counties in Arizona, which, again, we'll get into more next week. It did also, very importantly, include this, what's called the Bailout Provision, which says if you quit being racist, you can go to court and prove, hey, we're not racist anymore, and get taken out of the formula, get removed, from this provision.
Okay.
But as we will see, very few places ever actually accomplish that. And the reason all the coverage stuff is important is Section 5. Section 5 says if you are one of those places identified in Section 4, before you make any changes to your voting laws or procedures, you have to submit it to the Department of Justice for approval, for what's called pre-clearance. So this puts, instead of making it reactive like Section 2, where there's a violation of your civil rights and you sue, to get it fixed, this is saying for these places, we're not going to wait for that. We're going to, put the safeguard on ahead of time, and make you get approved for whatever problem, for whatever change that you want to make. So that was the really revolutionary part of the Civil Rights Bill, of the Voting Rights Act, and why it's considered the biggest, civil rights victory, one of the biggest pro-democracy bills ever passed, because it was proactive in that way. It didn't just say, oh, if your rights were violated, you can file a lawsuit and, fix it later on. It put this proactive thing in place.
But it's a bummer that this ended up seeming to not happen, because why did Congress not intervene when racial gerrymandering was, sort of spiking over time, and when clearly there were fewer polling places in communities of color, like around the country, like people were doing racist stuff on purpose. And like, this is the voting world that I have been in, right? As a citizen, as a voter for the last, 10 years. So why did Congress not step in? And then honestly, if I'm being honest, I didn't really know anything about this until the 2013 Shelby County decision. The SCOTUS basically, like, oh, you're doing a bunch of racist shit? That's fine. Keep doing that. That's fine.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? So, I mean, why did that happen? How did we get to even the pre-Shelby County 2013 reality where all of these voter suppression efforts were happening despite the fact that we have despite the existence of the Voting Rights Act? That's my question.
Yeah, it's Congress not doing anything. This has been, obviously, this is the thing we're in a situation now. We have one political party that benefits from these restrictions, that has an incentive to do this. And then we have another party that, has incentive to fix it, but doesn't, because we have people like Kirsten Sinema. That's the answer to the question. Like, we're going to talk about the filibuster. We're talking about Kirsten Sinema a lot on here. Passing these things, especially through a Senate where you need 60 votes because of the filibuster, is just really hard to do. Basically impossible to do. But yeah, and so an important thing, episode 3 is going to be largely about Shelby County. We'll talk about it. But the important thing to know about Shelby County is that section 4 and 5 that I just described, all the stuff I just described, doesn't exist anymore because of Shelby County.
Right.
They threw out the formula so that there is no preclearance anymore. That safeguard, that proactive safeguard, is gone now, and will be gone unless Congress passes the new HR 1 and then the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which again will only happen if we get rid of the filibuster, which again we'll talk about later. But that takes us to the last part here about, why we still need the Voting Rights Act. One thing that I found out in doing the research for this episode, it's always, again, a very disheartening thing when you look back and you see people in the past, they pass these bills and they really think like racism's going to go away, and you look back and you're like, you were so naive. Yeah. Because the actual original Voting Rights Act was set to expire in 5 years. They thought in 5 years, they wouldn't even need it anymore. Like, all these problems would be solved.
I am shocked.
Yeah.
I don't know anything to say other than I'm shocked by that. Isn't history interesting?
Yeah. So obviously 1970, we have not eradicated racism. So the bill gets reapproved for another 5 years, gets approved again in 1975 for another extension. And then that takes us to 1982, which is the next of the big extensions of it. And the 1982 one I want to talk about, because I think it's really interesting. So in 1980, so right before the bill is about to come up for this reauthorization, there's actually a Supreme Court decision, City of Mobile versus Bolden. And in this decision, the court held that Section 2, allows you to bring a lawsuit, only applies for quote unquote purposeful discrimination.
Wait, hold on. That means that in order to bring a lawsuit and say, hey, I was discriminated against, you have to already know that it was purposeful.
Yeah.
But isn't that contradictory to the point of how lawsuits work?
Yes.
Because you're supposed to be able to be like, I feel like I was discriminated against, and then you investigate what happened, which includes intention, motive. I mean, we've all seen cop shows, right?
Yeah, so, exactly.
Isn't that counterintuitive?
Yeah, you need to prove the intent of the lawmakers that passed it was racist. So you need, to do discovery. But even then, if you go to get to the discovery phase, even you need to find a memo, or something where the legislator passing it was saying, we're doing this to be racist, to prevent Black people from voting. Which again, as we talked about, the southern states in freaking 1880 figured that out, that you just don't say that part out loud, and you can just do whatever you want. You just don't say the racist part out loud. So this was an extreme limitation of the bill that went directly against the intent that was originally intended. this goes to, we can get into a conversation about, this is the beginning of the conservative legal project of textualism, and this is where textualism comes in, which says you only read the words on the page of a law, and conservative judges use that to severely restrict laws they don't like, and say it can't go outside of these boundaries. But then, so the bill comes up in 1982 for reauthorization, and to their credit here, Congress was like, no, that the Mobile decision was wrong, was not in keeping with the spirit of the law. So they wrote specific, so they wrote specific language in there saying that no, this covers anything that results in a denial or abridgment of the right to vote based on race. So they specifically said, no, we're getting rid of that intent thing, and any law that has an impact of racial discrimination of the right to vote. It's called discriminatory impact is the term that gets used in the legal cases. It gets covered.
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's where we get to the real interesting part. So this law passes, Reagan signs it. Ironically, it's all of the reauthorizations have been signed by Republican presidents. It was Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and then later W. And this is a time when there is starting to be this growth in the conservative movement of people who are like, we need to push back on voting rights. We need to keep, non-white people from voting because it helps us. But it was not, you couldn't say it out loud still at this point. And so Reagan did eventually sign the bill. But an interesting thing is, while this is happening, there was a young lawyer working in the Department of Justice under Reagan who really hated this discriminatory impact thing. He was like, no, we need to only be, intent, not impact. He wrote all these memos saying that Reagan should veto it because of this. He was ignored. And I can see that.
Do I get to guess who this is?
Yeah, I wanted you to guess who this was.
Is this Justice John Roberts?
Yes, that young boy. Yeah.
What do I win?
I know. That little boy grew up to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts.
And he's that racist ever since.
Yeah.
So that's unsurprising.
So yeah, so this is like, and this is something I had only learned doing this research in the last couple weeks for this episode. This is like our Joker origin story of who's going to become kind of the central villain of this whole story going forward. Because John Roberts has made it his life's work to destroy the Voting Rights Act. And it goes back, to the early 80s, when he was coming out of law school. But he's ignored at that time. The law passes with actually now a 25-year extension. That was a big part of the 1982 bill, was they at least realized like these 5-year extensions aren't really doing it. Like we need to keep this going for a while. So they passed this 25-year extension. That takes us into 2006, the W. Bush era, when it's coming up for reauthorization again. Here we start to get more Republicans starting to push back on the bill, and particularly this pre-clearance part. And there are Republicans that are saying maybe we should get rid of pre-clearance, like, getting racism's over, all that kind of stuff. And so during this 2006 authorization, there was a ton of investigation and fact-finding by Congress and by the Senate that went into this. They did hours of testimony. They took thousands of documents to show the necessity of keeping the pre-clearance provision in there. I have some quotes from that in here. In the statement of findings, which is actually in the bill itself, it says, here we go. Cited a continued need for the law based on evidence of discrimination against minority voters and the reduced effectiveness of the law due to U.S. Supreme Court decisions, quote, which have misconstrued Congress's original intent in enacting the law, like what we just talked about. Mm-hmm. And evidence before Congress has reveals that 40 years has not been a sufficient amount of time to eliminate the vestiges of discrimination following nearly 100 years of disregard for the dictates of the 15th Amendment.
So I like that quote. I like that.
Yeah, this is really good. Yeah, so this is in the 2006 bill. 2006 bill passes the Senate 98-0.
How often has that happened?
I mean, almost never. I mean, especially on something like this. Yeah. and again, this is the thing that, Republicans knew they couldn't come out directly against the Civil Rights or against the Voting Rights Act because it's saying the quiet part out loud a little too much. And this is 2006. This is, 10 years before Trump told them that they can say the quiet part out loud, which is kind of where we are at now. So it's passed. Like, the evidence is too overwhelming. So it passes for another 25-year extension in 2006. And that kind of takes us up then now. But then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, this passes in 2006. Only 7 years later, in 2013, in Shelby County, we have now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who basically thinks that, the Republicans in Congress are too wimpy to actually do what needs to be done, too scared of being called racist, very rightly so, if they undo this law. So he's going to take it upon himself to do that, and that's kind of where.
But isn't that a hilarious, contradiction to the textualism? Because if the Voting Rights Act, is written in the ways that you read it, I mean, it seems contradictory to me.
Oh, it completely is. I mean, Shelby County is a classic example of judicial activism, in that it is the judge making law from the bench, that fits his policy preferences, disregarding the very specific law that Congress passed, 7 years earlier, again, like very recently. And we'll get into that in the future episodes. But that's kind of where I'm going to leave it, for today. So you can see kind of this history, and again, there's been this ongoing struggle with the bill, right up to the present day. Even after it was passed, there was this pushback on it, and it's become just, more extreme, since then. And so, like I said, next week we're going to get into Arizona's history with the Voting Rights Act, which actually involves another Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts' predecessor, William Rehnquist, who was directly involved in keeping Black and Latino people from voting in Phoenix in the 1960s, actually went to the polling places himself to prevent people from voting.
Right. Wasn't he an explicit segregationist?
Yeah. He also famously was opposed to Brown versus Board of Education. Right. Yeah. And then, like I said, in 2 weeks, we're going to bring it back to John Roberts. We're going to talk Shelby County and Brnovich versus DNC. So to wrap up for tonight, what did we learn today? Like, what are your takeaways from all this?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to say is that because we were overviewing some, some differences in when different marginalized peoples gain access to certain participation in civic engagement in public fora. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that was said and not, just implied is that when we're talking about, like, at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about like post-Civil War Reconstruction rules. And then I mentioned, like, this is just men, right? And later we talked about women getting the right to vote. And I just wanted to kind of explicitly mention the intersectionality of the realities of both of these different types of discrimination for Black women. Black American women are both Black and women, obviously, and they have been just sort of doubly maligned by racism and misogyny. And I just kind of wanted to, like, say that explicitly.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's an important point. And again, this goes with, we're going to talk about some of the other groups as well, that this has affected over time. But Black women and women of color in general, have gotten this, from multiple sides. And again, that was something that, Frederick Douglass, as great of a man as he was, he basically decided that women, including Black women, were, expendable in that compromise that was made for the 15th Amendment. He decided, like, it was better to have Black men than nothing at all, and went with that, which, doubly affected Black women. Thanks for bringing that up. Anything else you want to say to kind of wrap up thoughts from all this?
I guess that my sort of final thoughts about what we learned is that, like, racism is everybody's problem. Because it really does filter in to kind of, it's obviously systemic and baked into structures, but the way in which that happens is all of these like small things, right? So we have the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, but then it's in a lot of places functionally irrelevant because people have figured out how to do these like small racist things, right? To kind of undermine it and undercut it. And so in some places it just like kind of didn't even really apply. And that's how racism is everywhere in the kind of small things that we either do or don't do. And therefore racism is all of our problems.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to say it. Like, yeah, racism is so baked into the system. This is the argument that, folks like Angela Davis and Ibram Kendi make, that because racism is so based into our system, there's no such thing as being not racist. You are either complicit in that racist system or you are an anti-racist that is specifically working against that system and to change that system.
Right. And white supremacy hurts everybody. So like as a feminist, I say all the time that feminism is for everyone, Bell Hooks's quote. And I genuinely believe that feminism is liberating for all of us, like regardless of your gender identity and your gender assignment, right? And regardless of your sexuality, like feminism really does liberate everybody from prescribed gender roles, right? And similarly, not the same, but similarly, white supremacy hurts us all, regardless of your race, right? It's a toxic premise for a society, and I really do think that it damages all of us. It would behoove all of us to dismantle white supremacy so that we could have genuine racial equality. That is my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've developed a bit of a reputation as like the voting rights person around here in Arizona. So around elections, I get questions about, why do I have to register 28 days before the election? Why can't I just show up on election day and register to vote then? Why do some states not do vote by mail or not do early voting? And the answer is racism. It's racism at the bottom of this. In a perfect system where we all agree that everyone should be able to vote and it's as easy as possible, every state would have automatic voter registration, would have vote by mail, early voting, all those things. But when we don't, and it prevents. And this thing, these laws again are designed, often to prevent particular groups, but it also again hits impacts, more disproportionately again on poor people, on young people, on students, on all these kind of groups. So I think that's a great place to end for tonight. Tiffany, I want to thank you so much for being part of this, being the guinea pig for the first one of these. Like I said, we are going to be back here the next 2 Wednesday nights next week. Keep getting my days mixed up. Thursday night. It's Thursday. Thursday the 25th, we're going to talk about Arizona and the Voting Rights Act. And then the following Thursday, which I believe is April 1st, we'll talk Shelby County, and our friend John Roberts will come back and we will see where he ended up. Once again, so we're doing this as the project of White Hat Research and Policy Group. So definitely check us out. Follow us on all the channels, Facebook, YouTube, so you get all these videos and see what else we're doing. And if you have any questions, comments, want to talk about this, shoot us an email at info@whrpg.org. And thank you so much for joining us, and everybody have a great evening.
Yeah, have a good night, everybody.